Almost 2 years ago, Season of Discovery was launched, and we got to experience one of the most experimental and interesting takes on vanilla World of Warcraft. We got lots of new spells to play with through the new rune system, sensible itemization on all gear, and some extremely strong tier gear tailored to more than one spec per class. We also got updates on how certain raid mechanics work throughout all the old raids, plus new dungeons and raids showing that Blizzard can create new content. I played SoD pretty consistently throughout the entire experience, and I was one of the only 5 people that didn't quit back in Phase 3, and I raided just about every week at level 60. So I want to go over the good, the bad, and the ugly of Season of Discovery. Overall, I think SoD was an amazing experience, and it built a solid foundation to build off of for Classic Plus if that ever does become a reality. So this is my review and story with Season of Discovery. Phase 1 of SoD started out super strong. There's a ton of hype in the classic community because people were quitting Wrath to play SoD because the Lich King was already dead. And there was a lot of cool stuff being added, like the rune system giving us spells from TBC and Wrath, Black Fathom Deeps would turn into a fun 10-man raid, and new specs like Mage Healers or Lock Tanks. We also got new items through improved professions and revamped itemization, and people generally love Phase 1. Leveling raids were one of my favorite features, and I hope they keep them if Blizzard does actually create a Classic Plus like they previously hinted. But even though leveling raids got outpaced somewhat quickly, there was still a fresh, unique path to leveling characters. They had some amazing rewards, so you would have people coming back to BFD at level 35 or level 48 still doing Nomer just because the gear was that good and the XP was worth it even if you were a bit higher. I thought the leveling raids were a fantastic addition to SoD and a great new way to level characters. The Nomer leveling raid wasn't received as well as the BFD one, as it was challenging for some pugs because the last 3 bosses needed some level of coordination, usually through Discord, especially if you had newer players who've never seen the raid before. But I remembered hosting a pug on a rat character early on, and we didn't full clear because none of us really saw the raid that much. But overall, Phase 2 was decent, even though it was a bit of a letdown, but the leveling raids were still pretty fun. What wasn't a fun new way to level characters were incursions. For those of you who didn't play Phase 3 or haven't played SoD at all, incursions were introduced in Phase 3 as an alternative to dungeon spamming. There were a handful of people who did not like that in Phase 2 the best way to level is spamming Scarlet Monastery due to the sparse amount of quests in the level 30 to 40 bracket. They feared players would spam Zul'Farrak to 50, just like how players spam Scarlet Monastery to 40, and fearing that dungeon spamming would kill the open world, they added incursions which, ironically, killed the open world. For those of you who don't know what incursions are or how they worked, essentially you would show up to a certain Emerald Dream portal around the world, Duskwood for players level 25 to 39, Ashenvale if you were level 40 to 49, and then finally Hinterlands or Fairless at level 50. You would get a prereq of killing demons outside of the portal, and after completing this, you would join a group to get all of the quests shared to you. And as there were 18 repeatable quests per incursions hub, the meta eventually became to circle around the area in a massive group of players and fight for tags on regular mobs. Bosses shared tags and retrievable items rewarded the entire group and had quick spawns. This led to the issue that incursions were so quick and efficient at leveling players that people just stopped running Nomer and people only did Maraudon or ZF to get previous gear at level 50. The rep you gained from incursions offered this gear, a trinket for melee, a ring for casters, and a bunch of good catch-up gear. It also became the best gold farm in the game, as the gold per hour just running around Hinterlands incursions over and over again with a massive group was greater than any open world farm you could do. I really cannot emphasize how bad incursions were on the initial release. Well, actually I can, because the Ironforge.pro numbers show that the Phase 3 player count peaked at around 185,000. And then it dipped to a staggering 28,000 players the week before Phase 4 launched. That's nearly an 85% drop-off rate. That's crazy. But after that, SoD maintained a fairly steady player base of around 70 to 80,000 after Phase 4. But the disastrous performance of Phase 3 was not just because of incursions. SoD was having a bit of an issue with player retention outside of raid logging, similar to Phase 2. Players would hit level cap, grind some prebis, and try the new PvP event, and then raid logger quit. And this combined with the fact that they suddenly raised the raid size to 20 for a leveling raid was a bit of a massive blunder. I was of the opinion personally that we should eventually move to a 20-man raid size at level 60, but for them to drop it on us weeks before phase launch, like, oh hey, you're gonna have to double your raid size for the casual leveling raid.
Huh?
I'm not really sure why Blizzard chose to raise the raid size to 20 for Sunken Temple instead of Molten Core. But when you review how many huge mistakes they made in Phase 3, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that Blizzard permanently crippled the player base SoD could have had because of how bad Phase 3 was. There were so many people that were not willing to give SoD another shot after Sunken Temple, and it wasn't just because of PvE stuff that they were screwing up on. The PvP scene was suffering quite a bit from early SoD. Between the mixed reception of PvP events and some very questionable class balance, I felt like PvP was rarely fun on SoD unless you played one of the broken classes like Shadow Priest or Boomkin. And while I've never been a big PvP player for most of the time I've been playing WoW, I felt like SoD had to have some of the most unfun and unbalanced PvP I've ever seen in any version of WoW, and not many people I interacted with felt differently. Shadow Priests in Phase 2 were able to kill any non-healing class with just putting Void Plague and Shadow Word Pain on a target. I remember back in Phase 3 on my Warrior, a level 42 Shadow Priest put Void Plague and Shadow Word Pain on me, and despite being level 49, I only survived because I had a health pot. Boomkins were very similar in strength too, but I typically remembered melee classes just getting absolutely dunked on by rage classes in PvP. I did like that they tried to do new events and we weren't stuck in the same 3 battlegrounds for all of SoD, but if they want a vibrant PvP scene for Classic Plus, they could get it by adding new battlegrounds, fixing the issues with the PvP events, and possibly adding Arena. Blizzard did some interesting stuff with SoD PvP, and while I don't think the choices they made worked out, I'm glad that they took some risks and tried something new so we could see what does and doesn't work in PvP. And speaking of things that didn't quite work out, that takes me to the rune system in SoD, the defining feature of this seasonal server. It was one of the coolest things they added, giving us a bunch of cool spells and passives to flesh out our class kits and rotations, and it gave us something to discover about the game. However, over time, I felt like they became more of a tedious task you had to do to play your alts and off-specs. Certain runes like the Dark Rider rune that every class had took a lot of time to complete, because you had to go to a very specific area in Deadwind Pass, Swamp of Sorrows, Duskwood, Arathi, Badlands, the Barrens, and Desolus. Summon a level 40 elite, kill it, and then loot its corpse to collect the 7 Dalaran relics, and then go all the way back to Deadwind Pass to turn in relics for your rune. If you couldn't tell, this chain took a long ass time to complete, and the more time I spent collecting my runes, I wondered, how am I supposed to find these without a guide? Especially since Blizzard stated they wanted people to not feel reliant on guides in finding these runes, but then they made them too hard for most people to figure out on their own. However, when Naxx came out, they did add a rune broker at each starting zone who sold every rune for 1 copper each, so it made it pretty fun to level a character because of how overpowered they were. And this spin on vanilla WoW was a lot more fun because of how much the runes spiced up our rotation, so I think that it was a pretty good addition overall. While Phase 3 was an absolute catastrophe, Phase 4 did a lot better, and there was an abundance of content now that the whole world was opened up. They gave us a badge system similar to TBC's, flexible raid sizes, and improved itemization. Molten Core and Ani came out with a new dungeon, Demon Fall Canyon in Ashenvale, which was a pretty neat addition to Phase 4. It kind of felt like a TBC heroic and had some pretty neat items like a Cursed Chalice, Resin Loop, and miniaturized fire extinguisher if you were pushing Heat 3 early on. If you don't know what I meant by Heat 3, Blizzard wanted to try experimenting with higher difficulties for all the vanilla raids in SoD. The general idea was each difficulty would increase boss health and damage, and more often than not add a mechanic or two to the fight that the lower difficulties didn't have. These higher difficulties rewarded either weapon cosmetics or more loot drops. The itemization was exactly the same regardless of difficulty, so it wasn't like Wrath where there's just a heroic and normal version of each item. To get these additional drops and cosmetics, you had to progress through Molten Core's 3 heat levels. Level 1 had no fire resist requirements. Level 2 needed 96 fire resist or higher, and level 3 needed 226 fire resist or higher. You had to meet the minimum requirements because if you were even a single point short of the required fire resist cap, you were gonna die when you got hit by any mechanic. I was just not a fan of fire resist being tied to higher difficulties in Molten Core and requiring players to cough up to hundreds or thousands of gold per character they wanted to raid Molten Core on just to hit the arbitrary fire resist requirement just wasn't great. And some of you might say, oh, we'll run Heat 2 for the extra loot instead. Because unless you were guaranteed some kind of fire resist buff in your party from a paladin or shaman, or you had your 6-piece, raiding Heat 2 was going to cost a lot of money. So I really hope you have a lot of fun farming your Devil Core set. But unlike in Molten Core, they kinda cook with Blackwing Lair. They didn't have any weird resist requirements, the bosses were more interesting, and they decided to add flex rating. But it isn't like flex rating in retail where the instance scales up with how many players are present. It kinda came up by accident. Basically, in Phase 4, there was a bug in Molten Core where you could bring up to 40 players despite it being scaled for 20. Blizzard caught this and reverted the change, but faced a bunch of backlash because players liked it, and Onyxia and all the world bosses already had this form of flex rating intentionally, so after they removed it in Phase 4, they said that it was going to be coming back in Phase 5. Which was nice because BWL was not the only piece of rating content released in Phase 5. They decided to make the Thunderon encounter that you need to do Thunder Fury a weekly world boss that had some pretty nice drops. And they also launched ZG and Blackwing Lair instead of splitting them between separate phases, which was a good change. They even added a hard mode for ZG where if you killed Hikar without killing any of the priests, he would drop 2 extra idols, so this made getting enchants easier, because the hard mode was very achievable in pugs. But going back to BWL, instead of having resistance requirements, they had a trial system where you could choose what mechanics you did each week. Of these 5 trials, there are the red, blue, green, bronze, and black trials. One of these trials will be active by default, switching each week, and each trial had a specific mechanic it would add to the raid, with the exception of the black trial, which adds a new mechanic to each boss. However, despite there being 5 trials, you only needed to have 3 trials active each week to get the maximum amount of loot. So if you showed up and pumped, you would be showered with tons of loot at the end. Plus it was pretty neat to see that they were adding new mechanics to the bosses separate from the trial system to make them feel new. And fortunately, this is a theme that they would continue going into AQ40. Which, despite being one of the least favorite raids in vanilla, I think they did a pretty good job at making this raid better. They added a quest that gives everyone a free 100% speed Karaji mount, so you're not reliant on those stupid trash drops anymore. They added sand piles that would explode, giving everyone a stacking movement speed buff, and they normalized Mind Flayer spawns and lowered the rep requirements to get tier. But don't get me wrong, the AQ trash was just as annoying as in 2019. The hard modes they added to AQ were pretty simple, just an extra mechanic or 2 per boss, and none of them were really annoying. I think they did a pretty good job at making AQ a better raid than it was, and it shows that there wasn't much drop off this phase, especially considering it was around the holidays. But a lot of people that did drop off would come back because SoD was about to release Karazhan Crypts the following phase. Kara Crypts has to be one of my favorite dungeons of all time. Blizzard said it would serve as a challenging 5-man instance for geared players, and I remembered my group spent hours on the first night exploring the place and figuring out the dungeon. Between the super dark theme, the engaging boss mechanics, and the extremely powerful loot this place had, I thought it was an absolute hit. And I had so much fun that I came back here with my Ashbringer just to blast and have fun with it. Even if you don't need any pieces because you got lucky early on, running this place was still really worth it because of the unique enchanting recipes inside and the large amount of reels you would get from clearing this place. If you don't know what reels are, it's essentially SoD version of the TBC badge system, where if you kill a high level boss, level 55 or higher, or you kill an older raid boss, you would get 3 to 5 reels per boss depending on the difficulty. This system was added in Phase 4, and it initially only gave Prebis rings, weapons, flask recipes, and Tier 0 gear, that dungeon tier that you get from running level 60 dungeons. But by the time Phase 7 came, they added more items to the reel vendor to keep it relevant throughout the entire season, such as all 8 Tier 1 tokens, half of the Tier 2 tokens, alongside idols, relics, bags, cosmetics, and supply crates that would drop various expensive mats. This addition of the supply crates became an efficient way to farm gold throughout SoD, and in the best way I could possibly think of, to add longevity to older content. People started running Molten Core, BWL, AQ40 pugs on their geared BIS main so they could collect the reels, and then trade those reels for boxes to make money. It's literally how I funded my Ashringer in SoD, and I hope that Blizzard will keep doing this to keep old content relevant for geared mains, because it's optional, and it doesn't force guilds to drag people to binding runs when Nax is on farm, or drag everyone to BWL for Nels tier or DFT because it's still BIS. Personally, I'm not a fan of how Kata, MOP, or Retail makes older raid content completely irrelevant gear-wise, but I also think that having players need to run Molten Core and Blackwing Lair the entire expansion for items like Quick Strike Ring, Drakefang Talisman, Onslaught Girdle, Rejuve Gem, because they just never get replaced, just leads to burnout. People don't want to be dragged to their guild's weekly Molten Core run for the 50th week in a row to try and get Onslaught Girdle because they just ran AQ and there's still no replacement for that item. But this optional reward of reels was so genius because now mains will carry raids because they either get a financial or cosmetic incentive to run old content. I mean, you could literally play Prop Hunt on Azeroth with a toy like this. Alts can come and scoop rotting gear and use their reels to buy tokens they lost the roll on or didn't drop, and I used this system to fund my Ashringer. I spent weeks running Kara Crypts, Molten Core, Blackwing Lair, ZG, Nightmare Dragons, and AQ40 to get the gold, and I had a great time doing it. While they did a great job expanding on the reel system and making the absolute banger that was Kara Crypts, the new hard mode mechanic for Nax was a bit of a miss. Basically, there was a new affix on gear called Sanctified, and for each piece you got, you gained a load of bonus damage, health, or healing, stacking up to 8 times. You could get Sanctified gear from Kara Crypts or Nax, and you needed this gear to progress in the higher difficulties of Nax. Trash was quite annoying because of this Sanctified system, and it formed a meta around clearing as much trash as you could on the lower difficulties, and then swapping it to level 4 once you're ready to do the bosses. And the scaling was difficult to balance because everyone had 4 times as much health and damage as they were doing the previous phase. Even in the Scarlet Enclave, I was only doing a third of the damage I was doing in Nax at full BIS. Fortunately, if you did get randomly one-tapped on trash, you didn't go the rest of the night without world buffs, because they added consumable world buff toys that gave every member of the raid world buffs. While this is a good solution to the annoyance that is world buffs, I kinda hope in Classic Plus they just remove world buffs from raids, because they force the devs to balance the raids around them. And if there are toys in Classic Plus, it's just another consumable we have to add to our long grocery list of raid night consumables. One of the odd things about this phase is that it was kind of up in the air if Nax was going to be the end or not. When the Classic 2025 roadmap showed that SoD was ending at Phase 7, it was received really poorly. Especially because at BlizzCon, when they did announce SoD, they basically promised some kind of Scarlet Crusade instance.
Okay, that shouldn't be here. That should definitely, okay, sorry, we should have, okay. Oops.
And Karazhan Crypts, which was received extremely well by the community, would have been the only new piece of content SoD got, and people were understandably pissed off about it. People were basically rioting in the streets of Stormwind about it. And the backlash was so immense that it got Blizzard to reconsider ending on Phase 7, And 1 month after Phase 7 began, they announced that Phase 8 would be coming. And oh boy, was Phase 8 worth the wait. Just like with Karazhan Crypts, the Scarlet Enclave was a massive success. And although there were areas that were rough around the edges, one issue the raid had on launch was the place was insanely overtuned. Top guilds spent hours stuck on Balnazar and Beatrix, mostly Beatrix, but this was such a massive issue that they sent the nerf hammer down on Balnazar and Beatrix the day after, and then decided, nah, that wasn't enough, and sent another massive nerf hammer down on both of these bosses. Allegedly, there were some bug fixes that happened during these nerfs that made Calderon and Council stop using their abilities when their mana was empty. So it's kind of funny that some guilds got kills draining their mana and all they could do was auto attack. So, yeah, the raid was a bit riddled with bugs, and it was a bit overtuned at the start, but the SoD team did an excellent job delivering on this raid tier. There was meaningful progress, and all the bosses felt pretty fun. I had a lot of fun going through this raid and progressing through the bosses, and on day 1, I was having a blast. I was just over the edge of my seat, anticipating getting my 6-piece and the legendary Ashbringer. Now, before we get into Ashbringer, I think we should talk about some of the tier bonuses, because Blizzard went fucking crazy with them. Warriors, for example, have 20% bonus cleave damage. Cleave can proc slam, hits 3 targets instead of 2. But our most broken bonus of all game, our 6-piece, doubles the damage Whirlwind does, and its cooldown is reduced by 3 seconds each time Deep Wounds ticks. Meaning, if Deep Wounds ticks on 4 targets after you Whirlwind, it just refreshes. Warrior Cleave was absolutely insane. I mean, look at this.
As is coming, get ready for the ads. Let's make sure we get a fear like 2 seconds later so we can get polys. Everyone focused on ads. Everyone focused on ads. Boss got moved.
Yeah, the target dummy.
Yeah, that was my dummy,
Gotcha.
sorry. I should have said
We have
something.
an ad that killed a healer on the right.
Blind.
Yep, look away.
It felt incredible. And while Warrior was without a doubt the best DPS at the end of SoD, a bunch of other classes got insane tier bonuses too. Warlocks got a 20% haste proc for 15 seconds each time a dot crits, and Range Hunters gained 25% more attack power for 10 seconds each time they crit. These tier bonuses were overpowered, plus with the addition of a shoulder enchant, that gives you a strong tier bonus from any raid tier prior to Nax, gearing characters was just mixing and matching your strongest tier bonuses. I mean, my warrior ran 6-piece tier 3.5, 2-piece tier 3, and 4-piece tier 2.5 on my shoulders. With how strong some of the tier sets were, it made us do some pretty big damage. And speaking of overpowered, I think we should talk about the Ashbringer, because this has to be one of the most broken legendaries in all of WoW. And it also happened to be quite an expensive one. But the questline is pretty cool, so I want to talk about it, which starts by getting the Ruined Lightforge Blade by Beatrix. It has a 100% drop chance, so if you get yours, talk to a blacksmith in Light's Hope, and then you're gonna head to Nax and give this guy in a cage 10 Chimeric Chops, and then you give him 12 Lightforge Irons. These drop from the bosses in Scarlet Enclave and the weekly quests that you do in New Avalon. After this, you become someone's indentured servant because you're going to need 20 Arcanite bars, 20 Obsidian Infused Thorium bars, 120 True Silver bars, 20 Righteous Orbs, and 10 Huge Emeralds, which actually peaked at 650 gold at one point, and I cashed in on it. After this, you hope your guild has cleared 8 out of 8 because you need to loot a hilt of the Ashbringer from Calderon. We use this hilt to summon the will of the Ashbringer, and he sends us to the blacksmith in New Avalon in the Scarlet Enclave raid, and receive the reforged blade of the Ashbringer. After that, we head over to Light's Hope and reassemble the corrupted Ashbringer with the hilt we looted from Calderon, the reforged blade we got from the blacksmith, and the emblem we got at Light's Hope. After realizing that we can't equip the corrupted Ashbringer in Light's Hope without getting murked, we head over to Moonglade and then Winter Spring, and we talk to a druid that flies us to the summit of Mount Hyjal. Once we arrive in Hyjal, you will want to collect some World Tree branches on either the ground or from killing the elite Trent mobs wandering around. Once we have enough branches, we use the branches we make to make a fire, heat the blade, and then we quench it in the Pool of Eternity, strengthening the corrupted Ashbringer. We use the Tempered Blade to talk to the will of the Ashbringer, and he sends us to the Scarlet Monastery to do the famous Scarlet Monastery roleplay event from OG Vanilla WoW, because now it's a step in the questline. Mograine will forgive his son by killing him, and you see that the blade is still not cleansed. With one last act to try and cleanse the blade, you venture back to Light's Hope and take a portal from the Will of the Ashbringer into Nax, where you have to defeat the Spirit of Mograine. It's a pretty cool fight, and I would recommend watching this video in the comments section if you want to see the whole event, because I only recorded half of my kill. But the fight enters its final stage once you get the Spirit of Mograine to 30% health. He runs to the center of the platform with some shades of Naxxramas trying to prevent the non-evil Mograine from cleansing the corrupted Ashbringer. With flaming boulders falling from the sky and Void Zone still spawning, we just have to survive and kill the 4 shades at the front of the door as he slowly walks up to his corrupted spirit. Once he arrives, he casts an aura of light and yells, "Be gone!" and then slays his evil spirit. Once we talk to the Will of the Ashbringer, we are able to claim our prize, the legendary corrupted Ashbringer, and then we will take a portal that sends us to the front of Nax, ending the corrupted Ashbringer questline. Now some will notice that the sword is still not fully cleansed and wonder, well, what was the point of that fight in Nax for? Because while we didn't fully cleanse the blade, we cleansed it enough that if we strike our enemies, the sword has a chance to temporarily convert back to its cleansed form, giving us a nice strength buff and some nice splash damage. This became my favorite question in the game, and the build up to getting this legendary felt great, and I thought it was really neat that it included parts of vanilla that weren't used for anything, like Hyjal or the Scarlet Monastery Ashbringer event. It made me pretty sad that this is where SoD ended. It became such a unique experience and acted as a glimpse of what Classic Plus could be. It was really interesting to see a version of Classic where they do active balancing, keeping hybrid specs viable, where there's new content around the corner. SoD proved that Blizzard is capable of making new content that is good. I look at Kara Crypts, the Scarlet Enclave, and the big revamps to a lot of older classic raids. Yeah, some of it wasn't great, and there were and still are kinks to work out with SoD, but I see so much potential with what they were able to put together with this random side project, and if they put an entire team behind a dedicated Classic Plus project with no end in sight, I think it could be great. My biggest hope is that Blizzard takes everything they've learned from this season and they make a dedicated Classic Plus server, because I know I can't be the only one getting tired of these re-releases and fresh servers. What's Blizzard gonna do after the Anniversary Realm wraps up TBC? Are they gonna go on to Wrath, redoing the trilogy? Are they gonna have Mob go on to WoD despite how unpopular it is so we can get to Legion? Or is Classic gonna try something new, take a risk and see what happens? Because that's what they did with SoD, and I think they delivered well despite all of my gripes and critiques I've laid out in this video. SoD had to be one of the most fun experiences I've had on WoW in years, and I really hope Blizzard makes something good out of SoD down the line, and we do get a dedicated Classic Plus.